morning, everybody. It is my very great and distinct pleasure to welcome you to the 2017-2018 Gladden Lecture. And I want first, before I introduce our lecturer, who I know sort of doesn't need any introduction, but I love bragging on him, so it'll be fun. But first, I want to thank and welcome Joe and Sally Gladden, who are here with us, where it's always such a pleasure to have you back on campus. Sally is an alum from the class of 1965, has been very active on the alumni board, very much one of the initial investors in Summit, Sally and Joe. And Joe, as I think all of you know, was chair of our board of trustees at a really critical time in Agnes Scott's history. It was one of those inflection points when, we've seen colleges that whose trajectories were downward and those whose trajectories were upward. I'm really happy that Agnes Scott's trajectory is upward. And a lot of people have played an important role in that, but one of the most important is Joe Gladden in his role as board chair. And so when Joe retired as board chair, the board created this lecture series, and I love the fact that it recognizes and showcases the scholarly accomplishments of our faculty, which is such an important thing at a fine liberal arts college like Agnes Scott. So please join me in giving a warm Scotty welcome. Welcome home to Joe and Sally. And I also want to recognize it's wonderful to have a former and current board chair here. So our current board chair, Beth Holder, class of '82, is here as well. So Beth, thank you for being here, as well as her colleague, Susan Hitchcock. We just had an executive committee meeting of the board, which was specifically designed by Beth so that she could come scheduled by Beth so she could come to the Gladden lecture. And so we're just really delighted that all of you are here, and I know that we're in for a real treat. The liberal arts college is really a pretty uniquely American phenomenon. There are a few of them around the world, but by and large they were invented and continue to be reinvented in the United States. And one of the things that's really at the heart of the vision of a liberal arts college is that of a faculty who are profoundly committed to the college and involved in its governance, and who are teacher scholars of the highest caliber, truly committed to teaching at the highest level, truly committed to their students, really committed to getting to know their students, to fostering their personal and intellectual development, taking pride in what their students go on to do after graduation, and also committed to being active scholars and to connecting those two enterprises and finding wonderful points of connection. And so if you think about sort of scholar, teacher, and college citizen, Gus Cochran has done it all, and done it at an incredibly high level for a really long time. You knew that I had to be partly a roast, sorry. But he joined the Agnes Scott faculty in 1973. And it is amazing, sorry, Gus, okay, I'm so bad. And what I love about Gus is that he is just as passionate and committed to the work, just as committed to making sure that faculty have a voice in college governance, but also just as committed to his own continual journey of intellectual inquiry and curiosity. And so I really think you're such a wonderful example of that, Gus. An incredibly productive scholar. He has published 2 books. The first, Democracy Heading South, National Politics in the Shadow of Dixie, and the second, Sexual Harassment and the Law, the Michelle Vincent Case. He's also published countless articles. I think it's 113 opinion or reviews in Choice alone, if I have that figure almost right, or close anyway. So prolific in his engagement with with the Academy, but also a public intellectual. So you will find Gus's work in opinion pieces in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. You will find him going back to earn a law degree after having been at Agnes for a while, I guess. You went back to earn your law degree. And then, just a few years ago, kind of falling in love with Brazil and learning Portuguese, and you know, he is going to be a Fulbright scholar in Brazil next spring. He will be lecturing at numerous institutions across the country about the American constitutional system. And so, you know, this is, I just think, Gus, that you are just such a wonderful example. We're so fortunate to have had you at Agnes Scott for such a long time. No, I'm just kidding. I'm very wicked. No, to truly to have formed generations of students and to show us what it is like to live a life of the mind that is always new and always fresh, and to still be a bit of a young Turk in your role with the faculty. So. And so, in line with this capacious intellectual curiosity, I'm really intrigued, and I think his topic is a very, very important one for our times, as part of his overall interest in democracy. And so he'll be speaking with us about you're hired, but are you really an employee? So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Gladden.
So thank you very much, President Quiche. Even the remarks about my time here are forgivable. It was a very generous introduction. It reminds me of what Alexis Herman told our graduates recently. It was an introduction that my father would have been proud of, but my mother would have believed. As far as speaking Portuguese, I don't claim to speak Portuguese. I claim to speak my Portuguese, which sounds a lot like my English, which is to say real Southern-like. So, boa tarde, y'all. I would like to say thank you to everybody for being here, especially my sister Becky, my younger sister, who doesn't mind anymore being called that, I don't think, and her husband, my brother-in-law Dan Aiken, is here from Athens, Georgia. I'd also like to thank Misty Dumas Patterson for a nifty PowerPoint, and China Wilson for showing me how to use the equipment. I would like to thank Professor Kathy Scott, Becky, my children Molly and Miller for helping me cut this lecture in half. I really appreciate that, but not as much as you will. I appreciate some retired faculty showing up for this, and again, thank you all for being here. I would like to recognize Joe Gladden also, and just say how much I appreciate him being the person for whom this lecture is named. I'm really enjoying my course release. You can imagine how nice it is not to have to try to explain American politics this semester at this particular time. I also want to, again, sort of reiterate what Elizabeth said and give Joe a real special thanks for his service as board chair. For those of you who haven't been here as long as I have, and I think that pretty much means everybody these days, I just want to say that we did go through some tough times in the 1990s, and it was really, really fortuitous that Joe was the chair of the board of trustees at that time. I was on the faculty executive committee at that time, and the faculty executive committee had to tell Joe some things that I really can't imagine he wanted to hear. I don't think any board chair would like to hear the kind of things that the faculty was saying in those days, but thank goodness he listened to us, he talked with us, and he showed the kind of leadership that brought the college through those critical times and sort of laid the foundation for the much better college that we are today. In fact, I'm not sure that any of us would be here today if it weren't for Joe Gladden. So could we give him yet another round of applause? Thank you, Joe. So It's a great honor to give the Gladden, but it immediately raises a problem, what to talk about. Before Elizabeth had even finished the announcement that I was going to do this, I was already worrying about what to talk about. By the next day at the tenure party, I had 14 topics on the list. I quickly narrowed that down to 3, but then I got stuck. I just couldn't decide. Can you imagine a Cochran being indecisive, Becky? Or better, Kathy, Dan? Does that sound familiar? So, being a type A Calvinist to the core, I decided to combine topics and talk about 3 for the price of 1, even without a coupon. So, here's what I'm going to try to do, skimming the surface of all 3 topics. First, I want to talk about who is an employee. This is an important legal issue because it determines who's eligible for legal protections. It's changing as it has historically, and fewer people today are being protected, I think. For the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about the U.S., although my long-term research interests are trying to compare Brazilian and U.S. employment law in the face of globalization. Secondly, I'd like to step back a bit and talk about the broader social context, and in particular a concept called neoliberalism that I think is especially illuminating as a kind of macro concept that sheds light on legal and other developments. Neoliberalism raises a kind of troubling paradox. It's an era and a concept that seems to offer us endless choices, but at the same time we seem to have less control over how we work and live. We have lots of choice, but sometimes not much voice because of neoliberalism's very thin concepts of freedom and democracy. And then finally, I would like to raise the sort of so what question and show you a little bit about why I study this by linking these issues to democracy. I came of age, hate to admit it, as a young man in the Cold War era wanting to defend democracy against communism. I then was in school during an era of segregation, Vietnam, Watergate, and I had to begin to ask myself, why didn't American democracy work better? Something I think a lot of people might be asking themselves today. And so I've been on a quest ever since to look for answers as to how to improve democracy. And I will just tell you that the most convincing prescriptions that I have found conclude that a say in working life is essential to an effective voice in government. I've tried to frame all these topics as questions because I'm a waffler. I make John and Carrie look rock solid. I try to be open-minded, cautious, appreciate complexity, but if I included all the caveats, questions, complications, and on the other hands that I would like to and that these topics deserve, we would not get out before sunrise, not sunset, sunrise. So I'm going to oversimplify and overstate, and so I invite you to take everything I say with a huge, huge grain of salt, remembering that everything I'm talking about is very controversial, very complex, and deserves debate and doubt. So let's begin with the question, who is an employee? Notice seniors, I have avoided framing the question in the form of a question that you're going to learn to hate this year. What are you planning to do next year? Instead, let's assume you're going to find work eventually, and that you're going to be able to move out of your parents' house eventually. But the issue is, will you be an employee? Because not everybody who works is considered an employee in the eyes of the law. So Catherine Stone begins her great book on employment law, From Widgets to Digits, with this revealing example. It's a painting by John Heaton, 1733, of a New York farm. In it, and it's hard to see, I admit, but all the adults are workers. But she says none are employees. So we can see slaves, we see indentured servants, merchants, craft workers, apprentices, the farm owner and his spouse all do productive work. none had the legal status of being an employee. In 1800, about 20% of Americans were employees, apparently. In the 19th century, workers became freer. We abolished slavery. We abolished indentured servitude, although some forms of coerced labor persisted, like convict labor, debt peonage, etc. But with the Industrial Revolution, workers became less independent as women and men lost the means to sustain their livelihood in their homes, where most production occurred, and they left their farms and craft shops and migrated to offices and factories, so that by 1900, about half of American workers were employees. Today, that figure is more like 90% of people who work for a salary or a wage. But recent trends suggest that in the coming years, fewer Americans will be classified as employees, and we may be moving back to an employee-free rather than a free employee economy. Why, and why does that matter? So, law has historically shaped the employment relationship. Traditional English and American law governed the employment relationship under laws called master-servant laws, which treated employment as a status, somewhat analogous to marriage, a stable relationship entailing duties and protections for both parties. Masters were bound to care for servants, but servants were subject to the rule of their masters, in whose households they often lived and to whom they owed obedience and loyalty. The normal contract was for a whole year, which made sense in an agricultural society because it balanced the seasonal rotations and the alternating seasons of light work and heavy farm work. These annual contracts provided stability of employment, but workers who left early forfeited their wages even for the work they had done. And in England, not here, but in England, you could be jailed unless you, or until you, returned to work. But master-servant law changed at the end of the 19th century. U.S. courts began to conceive of employment relation not as a status but as a contract. And rejecting the English rule of annual employment, American judges began to assume that unless a contract expressly specified its length, the employment would be considered at will, valid from moment to moment, as long as both parties, the employers and the employees, wanted the contract to remain in force. So employees gained appreciable liberty, mainly the liberty to quit without penalty, but they lost job security because employers were granted the legal discretion to discharge employees at will. To paraphrase one famous court decision, employers were able to fire employees at any time for just cause, unjust cause, or no cause whatsoever. And employees had little legal recourse because there's no breach of a contract, because it may be terminated at any moment. Not surprisingly, such unchecked power didn't go unchallenged, and the sociologist Karl Polanyi's theories almost perfectly describe the course of events. Polanyi said that societies have always had markets, but market society, the idea of a society organized totally as a self-regulating market, is not natural. In fact, it's utopian. Traditional societies always regulated markets through law and customs. Laissez-faire market societies were historical creations of liberal ideology and laws. Laws like property laws, corporate law, employment law, contract law, criminal law, without which markets couldn't exist. Polanyi believed that in some sort of reaction against market society was almost inevitable because society couldn't tolerate treating labor, land, and money as commodities to be bought and sold. He labeled all of those fictitious commodities. For example, labor is not just an abstract force of production, but it's a living human activity attached to human beings with needs and rights. So pure markets that treat labor like a thing to be bought and sold, according to Polanyi, will produce a double movement. First, the laissez-faire movement to deepen market society, and then a social movement to restore limits to markets for labor, the environment, and finance. So Polanyi's ideas describe very well the development of American employment law, Brazil's too, incidentally. First, to design a more or less laissez-faire labor market of at-will employment, and followed by movements to add protections to the people who provide that labor. So you can envision this as occurring in three waves. During the Depression of the 1930s, we passed the National Labor Relations Act that protected workers' rights to organize, and the Fair Labor Standards Act that provided for minimum wage and overtime. These New Deal laws create a kind of floor and somewhat rebalance the bargaining power, leaving space for employees and employers to bargain privately for the terms and conditions of labor. The 1960s, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibited employment discrimination on the basis of a limited number of factors, such as race and sex, which Congress augmented by adding other factors over the years, just a few like age, disability, but not as extensively as you might think. For instance, discrimination based on sexual orientation is still not prohibited, at least at the national level, not yet. Then this third wave that people see is a little more indefinite because it involves a bunch of miscellaneous statutes, things like regulating pension funds, occupational health and safety, and some state courts begin to narrow at will by imposing some implied contract terms and that sort of thing. The double movement has sort of stalled, I would say, since the 1980s. And the net result is this kind of framework for understanding employment law, which provides minimal protections. Let's see, how do I do this? So here, if this is the sort of totality of employer discretion to discharge employees, that would be limited by your individual contract, if you're in a union, a collective bargaining contract, and then also by these sort of waves of statutes sort of cut down discretion. You can't fire somebody for organizing, you can't fire somebody on their race or sex, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess what I want you to see is that the default, barring some contract or some statute, is at will, and there's a lot of discretion left in that at will category, so that employers are free to discharge employees who back the wrong political candidate or the wrong football team, or who exercise their free speech rights, or who live lives outside the office that the employer doesn't approve of, or to employees that don't live up to their employer standards of beauty, or for that matter, who are considered too pretty by their employer, so that you can be fired for lots of good reasons, bad reasons, no reason whatsoever, just not for illegal reasons, not because of your race, or not because of sexual harassment, etc. Okay. So I guess I want to pose the question of whether we are entering another Polanyian wave or movement where we may be removing some of these protections. And one of the ways that's happening, I think, is through narrowing the definition of who is an employee. Wait a minute. Sorry, I jumped ahead here. So statutes protect employees, or employment protection statutes protect employees. In a civil law system like Brazil, the labor codes will spell out the criteria for who meets the definition of employee pretty specifically. Our more pragmatic common law system tends to leave this up to judges and to sort of assume all sorts of common sense ideas, et cetera, et cetera. So I just picked out a few definitions. You can see the FLSA says an employee is a person who's employed by an employer, and then defines employee to suffer or permit work. NLRA, not much more specific, Title VII follows the FSLA. So they leave a lot kind of murky. And that might be all right when things are stable, but we live in a time of flux. A lot of these laws were written when there was a sort of standard model of employment, 9 to 5, industrial employment. Most people work for big organizations, big corporations. They had stable careers, often with the same employer for a lifetime. Attributes that are increasingly rare these days. Now people are talking about non-standard, contingent, casual, precarious employment. It seems to be rising exponentially. A few decades ago, it was estimated to be 10%. Now, people are saying it's about a third. It's predicted to grow to half the employees by 2020, etc. But I want to focus mostly on one specific type of contingent worker, the so-called gig employee, or let's talk about the sharing economy, the platform economy, on-demand, TaskRabbit, gig economy. Orly LaBelle defines the platform company as an online intermediary between buyers and sellers of goods and services. In other words, it's the ancient role of middleman enhanced with digital technology. So we're all familiar with Uber and Amazon and Airbnb. No one seems to know the exact dimensions of the gig economy. LaBelle estimates there are 10,000 gig companies out there, and the revenues are worth $1/3 of $1 trillion. Uber alone is estimated to be worth $65 billion, has mobilized something like 600,000 drivers in 195 North American cities, 68 countries, all of the time claiming to have to own no vehicles and employ no drivers. LaBelle refers to this as Uber capitalism, and she intends the pun. How can you have over 500,000 drivers and no employees? Because Uber claims that it's just a technological intermediary. It's just a high-tech matching service between people who want rides and their partner drivers who provide them. In other words, they are a technology company, not a transportation business. I'm going to go a little faster here because this is sort of general, but there is no lack of enthusiasm for the gig economy. People talk about platform fever for the people who are really the true believers in this new form of economic organization. On the other hand, there are plenty of people who point to all sorts of problems, the constant monitoring rather than trust, the blurring of work and leisure, the increased opportunities for discrimination both against customers and workers, the inequalities and injustice. But if we focus mostly on employment issues, the enthusiasts say that gig work promotes independence, choice, freedom, mobilization of underutilized resources, wealth of untapped opportunities. The romantic view is captured by TaskRabbit's slogan, a marketplace dedicated to empowering people to do what they love. Obviously, some workers do appreciate the opportunity to work part-time, supplement their income, exercise a little entrepreneurship, set their own schedules, work independently. But the critics claim that gig workers really aren't independent contractors and that this misclassification results in wage theft, underpay, overwork, and exploitation. For one thing, there's the constant monitoring that reminds some people of the panopticon. One judge actually quoted Foucault on surveillance as power. As far as subverting entrenched monopolies, half the business in each platform industry is done by one company. Uber, for example, controls 85% of ride sharing. Other signs of discontent among workers are multiple lawsuits, high worker turnover. 11% of Uber drivers are gone by the month that they start, and then 50% are gone after the first year, and attempts to unionize. Robert Kuttner claims that the TaskRabbit economy is using 21st century technology but reviving 19th century labor conditions where if you didn't own your own farm or your own craft, you are basically a casual worker. And he says, being empowered to do the work we love is the right slogan. It just doesn't describe the TaskRabbit economy. So, are gig workers independent contractors or are they employees? That's not as simple as it seems. One London court thought it was faintly ridiculous to view Uber as a mosaic of 30,000 small businesses linked by a common platform. And as far as Uber's claim to be a high-tech broker rather than a provider of transportation, the court said, Uber does not sell software, it sells rides. Uber is no more a technology company than Yellow Cab is a technology company because it uses CB radios to dispatch taxi cabs. But we need something more precise than that to do law, so let's look at some definitions. If the statutes don't help, the courts tend to turn to common law definitions, and this is probably the classic common law definition of if you're an employee or not. It's called the control test or an ends means test. It looks to the actual employment relationship to see who controls not just what work is to be done, the ends, but also how the work is to be done, the means. And so to do this test, use these criteria, the court looks to a bunch of different sort of facets. Who provides the tools? How are you paid, by time or by the job, et cetera, et cetera. It's a whole long list of factors, as you can see. The real problem with it is there's no one primary factor. There's nothing that's seen as determinative. There's no weighting of factors. You just take it as a gestalt. So as you can imagine, judges have a lot of room to make subjective judgments, and you get kind of inconsistent, unpredictable results. So some people argue, and some courts and agencies use instead, an economic realities test. It too has a lot of factors. The difference is this is supposedly trying to get at more the sort of broader economic dependency of the worker on the company. If you're really dependent, then you are an employee. If you're somewhat independent, then you're an independent contractor. And then some reform-minded jurists and some states, for instance, use a hybrid test called the ABC test. You can read the questions they ask, but what's important is this test tends to have as a default position a presumption that the worker is an employee unless the company can prove otherwise that they're not an employee. So some people argue that that's a better test. So what's at stake in defining people as employees or independent contractors? Well, if you're not an employee, then you are denied statutory protections for the right to organize, against discrimination, for minimum wage and overtime, for family and medical leave, for unemployment insurance and workers' compensation. Independent contractors have to pay their own payroll taxes, provide their own benefit packages, and it also is important as to who's liable in torts or in contract or for some compliance with government regulations. Liability, for instance, if you're in an accident in an Uber car, you're going to sue the driver who probably doesn't have a lot of money or else they wouldn't be working for Uber, or Uber has $65 billion. So Professor LaBelle offers us 4 solutions about what to do about the misclassification problem. One, the simplest, is just clarify the definition so that we can class people more accurately and more certainly. Second, we could just extend protections to all workers regardless of their employee status. Some people lately have been suggesting a third intermediary category, independent workers or dependent contractors, to kind of get that square peg into some other of a hole that currently doesn't seem to fit the peg. Or we could delink the social safety net from employment. Notice that LaBelle points out how we link so many benefits that in other countries would be general population benefits to employment, such as health care. And so you can see why the controversy over Obamacare is so important. And if we sort of generalized and extended that to the population, it would take away the importance of whether or not your class is an employee or not. Of course, the idea that the Democrats and the Republicans are all going to work together to extend social benefits to everybody seems a little far-fetched. I don't think you need a political scientist to tell you that, do you? So, what does the future hold for classifying gig workers? Well, I'm reluctant to make predictions. Like the great accidental philosopher Yogi Berra said, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. Some of the early cases seem to be tending to classify gig workers as employees, but it's hard to read them because they're so preliminary and just kind of an unsettled question. I'm going to kind of climb out on a limb and suggest that maybe employees are a dying breed and that fewer people are going to have protections of employment law. One reason might be because of President Trump. Can we just pause? And I've been talking 20 plus minutes now before saying that word. That must be a record for any political lecture or even a political conversation in this era. But the president is not likely to be appointing people to agencies or to the federal courts that are going to be looking to be more protective of workers, I think. Secondly, you could argue that broader trends in American employment law are to see fewer and fewer workers as employees. For example, the National Labor Relations Law is being blurred between professionals, who are included in the protection of the law, and managers and supervisors who are not covered by the law. So for instance, university professors are deemed to be managers, nurses, at least some nurses, are deemed to be supervisors. And as we move to a knowledge economy, it seems to me fewer and fewer workers, since we're all being asked now to use our heads as well as our hands, are going to seem like the kind of manual workers that the legislators had in mind when they enacted these laws. So that brings me to the second topic. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. That's the definition of supervisor that the courts are trying to fit nurses into or not. I'm not going to give you, what did I just do? I'm not going to give you much time to look at that. So I want to move on to the second topic here, which is the broader social context, because I think macro political economy sheds some light on these microeconomic and legal issues and helps us understand how they're developing if we sort of see the way broader political economy has developed. I'm going to rely a little bit on a school of scholars called Regulation School that sort of try to chart a middle road between orthodox or mainstream economics, who tend to see a more incremental growth to the economy, and Marxists, who tend to predict a collapse of the economy. What the regulationists see is a kind of pattern of cycles of growth, but then broken by intervals of crisis, experimentation, consolidation. So it's a pattern of continuity and change. The constant is capitalism. The change is the fact that capitalism is reconfigured periodically to meet new institutional molds. So here's just one set of authors' attempt to put that pattern to history and resulting in different stages or models of capitalism that we've experienced in this country. So you have a pattern of individual competitive capitalism that gives way to corporate capitalism in the Gilded Age, which collapsed in the Great Depression and the New Deal comes in and reforms it into Keynesian welfare state capitalism, or sometimes it really takes off in the post-war period and is known as Fordism, named after the assembly line of famous Henry. And so Fordism which is the post-war system, is a system based on mass production and mass consumption. Commodities were typically standardized. Henry Ford once quipped that customers could buy any color of Model T that their heart desired as long as it was black. Mass production requires mass consumption, and so it's a system that depends on the prosperity of the population and workers, so government plays an active Keynesian role in stimulating demand so that people will have some money to buy all those Model Ts. The companies are willing to, and people say formed an implicit social pact with unions to put more money in the workers' hands, so Ford workers can buy Model Ts. Sometimes that's called the Treaty of Detroit. Managers are free to manage, but the workers are free to organize and bargain. So despite its flaws, Fordism was an era of unprecedented prosperity. Personal income more or less doubled during this era. And it was a time, too, when it was fairly widely shared, so that people refer to it as the golden era or the golden years sometimes. I should say it's also an epoch of standard employment model of people working for one company with the expectation of long-term employment, internal career ladders, that people would expect to have a chance for promotion, a chance for raises, pretty regular work, and that sort of thing. So it wasn't without its flaws, but a lot of people look back somewhat sort of nostalgically to this. Now, why did Fordism fail then, and what's replaced it? Well, there are just lots of explanations and a plethora of labels. Toyotism, neo-Fordism, neoconservatism, post-Fordism, globalization. I tend to like either neoliberal globalization or maybe just plain neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a broad and very vague term. Bob Jessup calls it a chaotic concept. Other people say it's just a word that people use to denigrate any idea that they don't like. I'm going to give you sort of real quick views of different approaches to neoliberalism and understanding what it is. Maybe first and most obviously is it's a set of ideas. Free markets, small government, individual freedom are all valorized, and those are some of the thinkers that are most prominently associated with that. And then when it gets linked up with political movements, Thatcher, Reagan, it is a set of policies that will seem very familiar to you. So that's sort of one view. Not very different, incidentally, from old 19th century laissez-faire liberalism, this view, I think. Another approach, British geographer David Harvey cast neoliberalism in more radical terms as a political project, not just a set of policies, a political project to reclaim political power for elites that felt hard-pressed by the activism of the 60s, that corrected a lot of the flaws of Fordism, but also cost business money, equalizing or more equal pay, pollution controls, that sort of thing. And so Harvey sees neoliberalism as a counterattack to restore profits and restore capitalist class power. Political scientists Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson view neoliberalism through interest group theory rather than class analysis as Harvey does, but they offer a very complimentary account of neoliberalism as a counter movement by business. They, like Harvey, point to the 1971 memo of soon-to-be Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell to the Chamber of Commerce, where he said capitalism was losing the battle of ideas and recommended a counteroffensive. They think this signaled a shift in the balance of power in American politics as corporations beefed up their political arms, their campaign contributions, their lobbying operations. They also support Harvey's idea that it wasn't that successful as an economic policy. Growth hadn't been that impressive, but it was phenomenally successful as a policy to redistribute wealth up to not just the affluent, but to the tip-top 1% or even a fraction of the 1%. I don't have time to wallow in statistics with you, and I'm not very good at it anyway. So look at Robert Reich's Inequality for All, etc. But what I want to point you to, the one statistic that amazes me, is Oxfam just put out 8 individuals, the wealthiest 8 people in the world, have as much wealth as the bottom half of the people in the world, the bottom 3.5 billion people. And I might tell you that in 2010 it took 388 people. Now it just takes 8 people to equal the bottom half. Another way to look at this is to compare the sort of classic Fordist company, General Motors, that's sort of ironic, isn't it? With the classic template for neoliberalism, Walmart, and just look at the bottom 3. With less employee power, the salary differential is impressive, and a lot of that income is being redistributed up to the top executives. I could go on, but I can't. So let me just quote. Wealthy investor Warren Buffett wasn't joking when he remarked, "There's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning." So Hacker and Pearson say this wasn't just a phenomenon of technological change, it really is policy change. And one of the policies they point to, of course, is in fact employment law. And one of the interesting things they say is that it's not so much that we changed the policies in many instances, we didn't change them as the circumstances changed, and they call that drift. And that is classic because, look, I think the National Labor Relations Act's 82 years old. The last significant amendment to labor law is about 70 years old. So classic case of drift. Another way to understand neoliberalism is hegemony. Just briefly, it's just that some ideas become so dominant they just become almost common sense. So think about the inversion from the New Deal era when it just made sense that government would try to solve social and economic problems, to Ronald Reagan, who said government isn't the solution, government is the problem. One of the great things, I think, that shows the power of neoliberalism is it doesn't even seem like an ideology or an idea. It just seems like reality, and it's widely accepted on the left as well as the right that the only solutions are market solutions, so carbon trading for the environment, individual exchanges for health, micro loans for economic development, etc. When asked what her legacy was, her most important achievement in being Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher said without even hesitation, Tony Blair. You wonder if Ronald Reagan would say the same thing about Bill Clinton. So let me move on to the last way to understand. I think this is the hardest way to understand neoliberalism, but Wendy Brown sees it as a kind of logic, a kind of rationality that permeates all of life. So I see a lot of economists in the audience, so it's not just economic thinking in economics, but it's economic thinking in all areas of life. Politics, obviously, things like austerity, balancing the budget, etc., but also in law, in media, culture, philanthropy, social change activism, social entrepreneurialism, religion, the prosperity gospel, personal relations and conduct, be your own brand. So she sees this as a kind of economization, economics all the way down, that shapes not only our choices but the subject as choosers. So I think I will just have to not give a lot of examples and move on. The trouble is, I want to say, is that this offers only a kind of thin notion of what freedom's about as individual choice without external interference, but it's the kind of freedom of consumers who can pick anything among offerings on the market but have no say in the structure or context of markets. So Elizabeth Anderson puts it as choice within a set is not choice about the set itself. So real quickly, looking at Uber drivers, they seem to be perfectly free. They don't work for Uber, they work on the platform. They have all sorts of autonomy. They don't have their bosses riding around with them. They can work their own hours. They can buy their own cars. They can accept or decline rides, but it's a little bit illusory, some people argue, because there's a lot of indirect supervision. They're subject to automated and algorithmic management according to a standardized set of specifications that the company sets, not them. So, for example, they can't set their own rates. They can't choose their customers by destination, even if they lose money. If they cancel too many rides, they will be deactivated. They can decline rides once they turn on the app, but they have 15 seconds to decide, and if they don't accept 80 or 90%, they are discharged. They have this code of conduct that's just suggestions, but it's enforced by the customer rating star system. If they don't maintain a 4.6, they'll be let go, and pretty strong suggestions, etc. There's a New York Times article, I think September 3rd, that detailed 12 different psychological techniques that Uber uses also to sort of manage them. And basically, because of the information asymmetry, Uber has a lot of power over them. I'm going to have to skip this part, but I just wanted to show you that driving itself is often seen by Americans as the definition of freedom, right? So I wanted to recommend this book because Sailors points out that while driving seems so free, there are few activities that are more surveilled and regulated. You have to have a car. That usually means a loan, so you're chained to monthly payments. You have to have a license. That means all sorts of documentation. Usually it means training. You've got to register the vehicle. You got to have an inspection. There are all sorts of rules, speed limits, not that we worry about that in Atlanta, but you know, there are all these rules, and mostly you have to go where there are roads, and I think that explains SUV ads, because notice you always see them, they're looking over these vistas of freedom. But this is what we're really doing, and the one solution to our transportation problems in Atlanta is kind of off the table. What we could really use is some reliable, safe, clean, comfortable, convenient, and cheap public transit, but that's not on the option. Why is it off the table? Well, a lot of reasons, but maybe money. This moves me to say what I think is wrong with the notion of democracy of neoliberalism, and that is illustrated by Citizens United, a case where the court struck down regulations on some election finance regulations to permit corporations to give money to finance political speech. The interesting thing is they struck it in the name of individual rights, free speech under the First Amendment for corporations, but what they did is they struck a democratically enacted policy that would regulate our elections to protect the integrity of our elections, but said we as citizens collectively cannot enact those kind of regulations. Let me just end by saying, here's what Wendy Brown says about neoliberal citizenship. The model neoliberal citizen is one who strategizes for her or himself among various social, political, and economic options, not one who strives with others to alter or organize these options. Sam Huntington, who basically laid out the blueprint for neoliberalism, diagnosed our problem way back when at the dawn of neoliberalism as saying we have an excess of democracy, and rejected Al Smith, who said the cure for democracy or the ills of democracy is more democracy. Well, I guess I would like to argue the opposite in a very brief conclusion. by just saying that I don't think having a menu of choices are enough, that I think real citizens are owners of the community, and we need to be owners of the restaurant so that we can design the menu and help lay out the options. Fortunately, democracy is not a single story. There are many models of democracy, and I would recommend Carol Pateman, who traces two historical views of democracy. Basically, she argues that democracy being limited to elections among competing elites is not enough. It requires the active participation of citizens. This strand of democracy argues that being able to participate in the choices that affect our lives not only is intrinsically important, but it is also a means to further our flourishing as human beings. Are we up for that? Up to that? Pateman offers two, you might call them hypotheses. One, she says the best way to develop the ability to participate is practice in participation. It's the best, it's sort of like responsibility. The best way to make somebody responsible is make them responsible for something. So there's one hypothesis. The other hypothesis is a spillover hypothesis, that if we develop these skills at work, and after all, we spend half our lives at work, and we're interested in what goes on at work, and we're more knowledgeable about what goes on at work than what goes in Washington, perhaps, then we have our best opportunity to develop these skills at work, and those skills would, we hope, spill over. So I guess what I have been arguing for is more worker voice, that choice among options isn't enough. We have to have voice in shaping options, and that there are various ways to accomplish that or to extend that at work. Some are rather minimal and already exist, like employee involvement programs are very common in corporations today, to rather radical fundamental changes. I would like to point just one. As I wrote this, I thought, why don't on-demand drivers just organize cooperatives? I don't know whether they could, but if yellow taxi companies can become co-ops, why can't Uber drivers? I think I will quit there. I was going to address, is this possible? But let me just say it might be, because if you look at those periods when we sort of get into situations where we need to develop new institutional structures, and then if you look at this sort of history of realignments in American electoral history, roughly they seem to line up. Realignment theory says that all elections aren't equal. Some elections represent more or less seismic shifts where something really important happens. New parties are born, coalitions shift, or new majorities take place. It may be that we're in one of those times of institutional flux where we as citizens could exercise our voice and really make a difference. But to tell you the truth, I'm not sure. I told you, I'm a waffler. So we'll see. I do have one more slide. I would welcome comments, questions, criticisms, debates. In Brazil, we would call this dúvidas, doubts. And I've got a few things that, if you want to read, might be useful to read to go further. To cover all the parts, I had to skip over because I am a professor. Can't talk. I had a professor who said professors can't clear their throat in less than 50 minutes. So I pretty much proved that, I think. Sorry. Yes?
This was great. Thank you. Do you see the union movement? I mean, some people are seeing a rise in unionization. Certainly, there's been an effort to unionize adjunct faculty, graduate students. But looking at it more broadly, as you think about, is this a time of perhaps the invention of new institutions or a cycle of a return of more protective mechanisms? So where do you see this innovation playing out? And are unions actually helpful to this vision, or are they just as anti-democratic in some cases?
It's a really hard question because there are unions and then there are unions. That's one thing, and union movements are different in different countries. Our union movement sort of chose the business union, just we want more and limit yourself to benefits and pay, and not so much trying to reshape work and give workers more autonomy on the job or even have a say in management. For instance, the Swedish unions are the opposite. For instance, I had a chance to study Sweden, and it's interesting because, you know, I think most American employers would go, oh my gosh, that's the last thing I need. I had an interview with a Volvo plant manager one time, and he said, you know, I couldn't run this plant without the union. Now the guy, his assistant, who has to actually deal with the union, was sitting there rolling his eyes, I will have to admit. But in other words, that's a whole different kind of union movement. And as far as reviving, I'm not seeing much evidence that it is. I mean, they've certainly been trying ever since the 90s, really, really hard. But it's down to something like in the private workforce, 6% of American workers are unionized now, and I think the Supreme Court this year will probably pretty much be driving the state through public unionism in some of the case, a particular case that's before it this year. So it's really in bad shape. I mean, one thing though that's interesting that you mentioned is that at least it's possible that new forms of organization are going to come and fill the void, not the old kind of unions. The Fight for 15 is more almost like a citizens union. A lot of people are writing about worker centers, which tend to focus on workers more in the community setting than at the workplace setting. This Catherine Stone has spent a lot of time thinking if employment's changed, employment law needs to change, and unionization needs to change. So I'm not sure I have a very specific answer, but I think it's going to be broader and loose. Ask me again at the end of the semester when we cover some of that in 360. So, yes?
Yeah, thank you for that. I love the transition that you drew our attention to, how the move from choice to voice. I'm wondering if the third wave isn't a stake. So when Bill Gates talks about, for example, the dangers in 20 years of automation and how that's going to take over the majority of blue-collar work, I wonder whether adding a sense of individual workers having a stake in those companies moving forward, or how do you see automation as creating a different kind of landscape for the worker?
Yeah, and in fact that sort of goes to something Elizabeth said too, and that is the old style union is more protective, I think, than proactive. And I mean, that's the thing about in co-ops, it sort of makes moot the whole question of are you an employee, because everybody's an employee, but everybody's an owner also. And I think that probably is the way to go in the longer run and in the future. I recommend a book I had to review, it was last fall, James Livingston, called No More Work, and one of the nice things about it is 100 pages. And another nice thing about it is he's very funny. And he starts by saying, I'm ready to retire, and I think everybody should be. And and he talks a lot about automation. It's not as careful a book as I think in some ways it ought to be. For example, he confuses work with jobs, but he's really on to these sort of hair-raising questions about automation, and he points out that we have linked income to jobs. And if there are going to be fewer and fewer jobs, and the projections are just scary, then fewer and fewer people are going to have income, but everybody is going to want to live. So what are we going to do? My rough sense, incidentally, is that people who are thinking about this issue of work are sort of split on two broad sort of directions. one is a kind of universal basic income and just separate income from work, at least minimally. And there are a lot of advantages, and you get surprised. I mean, Milton Friedman was a big advocate of a negative income tax, and there are all sorts of arguments that, for instance, if everybody had sabbaticals, people could improve their skills. If everybody had at least a guaranteed income, you would get all sorts of entrepreneurship because people could take a chance. That right now you take a chance and it doesn't work out so well, you starve. The other sort of strand, I think, is more to improve work, make work better. And I think that has always been my tendency, I guess because I'm a workaholic and can't seem to leave it even after low these many years. But it seems to me that work, not a job, but work is a kind of human need, and it could be expressive, it could be contributory, and a lot of satisfying things. But I think that would require a good bit of reorganization of work. So you get that sort of dispute about lessen it or improve it. Yeah.
Have you observed how the basic income has been instituted? I mean, in Finland they have experimented with it, and in Germany they're doing crowdsourcing. They're giving out 1,000 euros per month for a year to people crowdsource that, and there's experiments going on with basic income. Have you monitored that?
I have not, but I'm aware that there are, and I mean, ironically enough, Richard Nixon proposed basically a guaranteed income back in the 70s. It's called the Family Assistance Plan, and there were experiments done before he proposed that. That didn't get passed, incidentally, but there were experiments before, and on the whole, I mean, I think what I remember was that people on the whole didn't stop working. They changed jobs more frequently. There was some, as I recall too, there was a kind of real boost in, one of the things that bothered some people is a boost in the divorce rate, as I recall, because women were no longer dependent on their husbands and got kind of liberated based on that. But that was very disturbing if that's going to be the impact, But there were other more salutary impacts, but I don't know about that, but I know that there are plenty of people that say it's a workable from all sorts of conservative as well as left kind of criteria. Yeah.
Has it worked in Brazil? Wasn't there an experiment in Brazil at a minimum?
Oh, that's the Bolsa Familia. Yeah. Well, it certainly, Brazil became much less inegalitarian. I mean, Brazil has one of the most unequal distributions of wealth of any country. I will tell you that I went as a high school student, embarrassingly enough, in 1963, but I've been going back since 2001, pretty much every year. And I will tell you that from 2001 till about 2010 or 12, it was perceptible how much more prosperous Brazilians were. You had much less evidence of just abject poverty. Whether that's because of that social welfare program, again, the Keynesians sort of argued that you're putting money in people's pockets and there's people who will have to spend it, and they did, and it'll create demand and it'll fuel the economy. Other people argue that Brazil just followed a more neoliberal, despite having a socialist president, that they followed a neoliberal economic model of just exporting, particularly commodities, and that they were just lucky China came online and started buying massive amounts of Brazilian exports, and that's what produced that prosperity. Since then, I might add, things have really fallen apart in the last 2 or 3 years. Brazil is a mess. There's no doubt. I tell my friends down there, I don't guess I will say that. Sometimes I say, you should look at us and say, thank God for the United States, and we should, if we knew more about them, we would be saying, thank God for Brazil, because their politics are a mess. Makes us look good.
My sense of looking at 3.5 billion versus 8, I'm sorry, my sense when I look at this figure, 8 people have as much money as the bottom 3.5 billion people on the planet is kind of twofold. One is, I would think at some point the 3.5 billion would look up and say, let's send 10,000 of us to get that guy's Bentley. But the other thing that occurs to me is at some point the imbalance is so great it becomes literally impossible to redistribute in the other direction.
Oh. Hmm.
There will be no mechanism to make that possible. Tax mechanism, no trucks full of money delivered to poor neighborhoods. I mean, there's no way to back off of that.
Yeah. Maybe I should say, and this sort of goes to Ed's question too, I mean, there are now really mainstream economists who are arguing that this great imbalance and inequality is an economic problem. It's not just a justice problem or a moral problem, but that it's going to undercut demand, and there's only so much stuff 8 people can buy, or it's not really 8, but the top, it really is the top 1/100th of 1% or the top 1% and that sort of thing. So I mean, Joseph Stiglitz writes about that, Krugman writes about that, etc. But the other thing I actually wanted to mention is that, I mean, most people view this as then calling for redistribution, right? Redistributing income and all that. But if you read, this is a really, Robert Reich is a very liberal economist, and he argues that, if you try to, once it's in your pocket, everybody resents having the government come take it away because it's yours, And he says the real problem is the or the market distribution, not the redistribution after the market has already distributed it, and that we need to rethink some of our market rules, things like intellectual property rules. The very right to unionize, the law makes that either easy or hard, and that the difference in those distributions isn't from redistribution as much as the rules of the market. But again, like Polanyi, he talks about the market rules don't just fall from heaven. They aren't just natural biological rules. They are created by law. We say what the employment rules are, for example, whether it be by statute or by common law, which is basically judge-made law. Gunda.
One word that didn't come up in your presentation that surprised me when you talked about workers and employers, and that was the word strike. That where I grew up would have been almost the default accompaniment when you talk about labor relations and employment, and especially in that last point when you talked about redistribution. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you see that placed, if you see a role for that.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not there yet in rights at work, so I'm talking from memory. I should have refreshed my memory on this, but again, I have my own personal feelings, a little bit like the answer about labor unions. It's a kind of last resort. It's not the best thing for anybody, but it's interesting because the National Labor Relations Act guarantees the right to strike. It's bargaining, but both sides can use economic pressure. The employer can lock you out and say, think it over while you're going hungry. Incidentally, that's illegal in Brazil. That's one difference. But also you have a legal right to strike. And that hasn't ever been changed since 1935. Fairly soon after, there was a Supreme Court case that ruled, yes, you have a right to strike, but your employer can replace you. And not just replace you while you're out on strike, but they can replace you permanently. They can't fire you, that would be illegal. But when you come back, if there's somebody in your job, they say, oh, so sorry, but somebody has taken your job in the meantime. You're still an employee. If we ever need you, we'll call you. And in the meantime, of course, most people go and find another job. Apparently that was a decision in the 30s, but it wasn't much used. But beginning, again, part of the reason I think this neoliberalism is so interesting, beginning in the late 70s, early 80s, apparently it started being used pretty widely, and people say, why? It's been on the books for all these years. And some people say it's because the nature of the employers changed. Corporations became transnational corporations. They're not tied to local communities. They don't, the CEOs don't go to the Rotary Club and have to face the community who's saying, why are these people on the street, and that sort of thing. And now it's more a kind of social change than legal change. Right now, I mean, if you look at statistics, though, I mean, that's one reason I think people don't join unions is what's the point? You pay a bunch of dues, but the main weapon that the union could use, imperfect though it is pretty much off the table, because if you go out on strike, you're just slitting your throat. They're just going to replace you with somebody else.
Hi. I wanted to take off on Adeline before I ask you a question, but in archaeology, there are a number of cases that I know of where you see greater equality, less stratification at the end of empire. So maybe that's how it's going to happen. I mean, you know, cities abandoned, statues defaced, people massacred on a grand level, and populations moving out. So maybe, and that was my sort of question, because your chart says we're way past due for another big crisis, a 20-year, 25-year thing. So the way I see crisis or understanding regulation is this: it's a change in the way people accumulate wealth that happened between, say, 1970 and 1980. And I guess my question is, how are those 8 people accumulating the wealth that they got? Because is it only just exploiting workers by paying them less? Or it's not a monopoly? I mean, it's like Bill Gates, so that's my question. How will those 8 people make it?
Actually, I think I had to skip part of this about, I mean, one of the reasons I think Uber and other companies want to call their workers independent contractors is that those independent contractors then bear the liability, some of the costs, and that sort of thing. And one estimate I saw is that it would save the company about 25% of their labor costs by classifying their workers. So that's one way. And Uber, if their employees were reclassified as employees, would owe almost $1 billion to their drivers. Mark and I were in a little informal discussion group about regulation theory a few years ago, and I wouldn't pretend to be an expert in it. And there are lots of real strong criticism. What I like is the whole idea of the stages and the idea that capitalism gets refigured. So, I mean, for instance, I think Robert Reich is really naive because he's always wanted to go back and have a New Deal, and there's a lot to be said for, you know, things have changed, and, you know, it's not just cyclical and all that. But the 2 problems that I have most seriously is, one, I don't see in what I've read so far an explanation about what causes the crisis and causes the change. I think the main hypothesis is interesting, is that economic problems need some sort of institutional infrastructure, the mode of regulation, labor law, credit, government policies, etc. But then those seem to last only about a generation. But why? I mean, is it just some sort of entropy of institutions, or is there a general answer or not?
The idea was that the rate of increase could no longer continue. So the Fordism model, they kept making more and more money, and workers sort of went along with it because their wages would increase even though not the same rate as profits. But then there got to be a point when those profits just could no longer be left in the stone and everything. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's basically right. But the other problem, and you point to it, is that, I mean, I don't know, I don't get a clear sense of knowing where we are in these cycles. So it was 2008, the crisis of neoliberalism, and now we're in this period of experimentation and everything's up for grabs, or was that sort of the last gasp of the New Deal post-war era? Now we're really in a consolidated new neoliberal stage. I mean, it's just, it's very hard to know, and therefore whether this is really useful as a strategic guide, I'm not so sure.
In the long view, as an anthropologist, I think that we are at the edge of the end of the empire. We both the Soviet Union and the United States, and it may take a few more years, but that would be my take.
Before I call on Professor Scott, I will try to filibuster and avoid that. Let me just, if you talk about end of empire, what has really impressed me, I have not been, despite the political science
what would historically be sort of focused on environmental issues. I cannot claim to be an expert on environmental causes or anything, but climate change, I think, is, as Naomi Klein says, this changes everything. And I think that probably in terms of shaking things up and putting some real rethinking on the agenda, besides automation, the other big thing that's happening that's going to make us go back to the drawing board and redesign things. We can't be Fortis anymore. We can't just keep cranking out Model Ts and cell phones and television and whatnot. Okay.
Well, but what I think would be such a great idea is if we go have a drink and we talk about it.
But before we do that, I would like to ask you to join me in thanking Professor Campbell.